From the ashes of the American Civil War sprung an economic powerhouse. The factories built by the Union to defeat the Confederacy were not shut down at the war's end. Now that the fighting was done, these factories were converted to peacetime purposes. Although industry had existed prior to the war, agriculture had represented the most significant portion of the American economy. After the war, beginning with the railroads, small businesses grew larger and larger. By the century's end, the nation's economy was dominated by a few, very powerful individuals. In 1850, most Americans worked for themselves. By 1900s, most Americans worked for an employer. The Grangers. An organization of farmers in the late 1860s was designed by Oliver Kelly to make Western farmers feel less isolated or out of touch with one another, and more like a community to get them to work together to solve some of the common problems they were having and the difficulties of farming in the West. Collectively, the Grangers felt the most pressing issue was the railroads. The Grangers felt they were being oppressed by the power of the big railroad companies. Since there was no regulation of big businesses, these farmers had no choice but to give in to the control of the railroad companies, transporting their crops because the farmers were dependent on outside markets to sell their crops to in order to make a profit. The major railroad companies took advantage of the farmers by overcharging the cost of the transportation of crops, especially the shorter distance transportation fees, because those were more common than long distance, so the railroad tycoons could make more money off of less. The railroad companies also used rebates and free passes to make the cost of shipping for the farmers greater. Eventually, the Grangers revolted against the railroad companies who were taking advantage of them, leading to government regulation of the railroad monopolies. In 1869 to 1875, laws were enacted to establish public regulation of railroad rates and operating practices. Munn v. Illinois was a Supreme Court case in 1877 that declared individual states could regulate railroads within their borders, which helped farmers because it set a regulated transportation costs, and railroad companies could charge farmers. The railroad companies, like Munn and Scott Warehouse firm, started lawsuits against these laws, claiming it was in violation of the 14th Amendment and a violation of the Constitution to regulate interstate commerce. The lawsuits were acquitted because the warehouses and transportation were for public use and therefore needed public regulation. However, in 1886, in the Wabash case, the Munn v. Illinois decision was overturned, leaving the federal government to regulate interstate trade and declaring it unconstitutional for states to do so. In 1887, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act, which railroad companies found more reasonable than the previous state laws. The Interstate Commerce Act regulated that shipping rates must be reasonable and must be published. Secret rates were now illegal, as well as price discrimination in small markets. The Interstate Commerce Act was enforced by the Interstate Commerce Commission and several government acts, such as the Mann Act, the Elkins Act, and the Hepburn Act, which all helped ensure the Interstate Commerce Act was being upheld properly. The wage workers also felt unprotected from the demands of the companies they worked for, like the Grangers. As a way to protect themselves, the workers formed unions in order to have a little more of a say for their work for the companies, as well as gain more job security. Unions did this in many different ways, one of which was collective bargaining, the process of negotiation between representatives of workers and employers to establish the conditions of employment. This may cover not only wages, but hiring practices, layoffs, promotions, job functions, working conditions, and hours, workers' discipline and termination, and benefit programs as well. Unions were typically based on race, gender, and skills, like the American Federation of Labor and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. The American Federation of Labor represented only skilled white male craftsmen in the cities. Despite this limitation, the AFL survived the Gilded Age and would become one of the most powerful labor unions in the new century. The AFL was founded by Samuel Gompers in 1886, seeking better wages, working conditions, shorter working days, and the creation of all union workplaces for its members. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union was formed in the 1900s. Most of its members were Jewish immigrants employed in sweatshops. Successful strikes in 1909 and 1910 in New York City by the ILGW resulted in a protocol of peace between the women's clothing industry and labor. The protocol helped to increase wages, reduce working hours, and the union was finally recognized by the clothing manufacturers, and the Board of Arbitration was established to handle labor management disputes. While many unions were created for a single, specific group of people, some unions were not as selective, like the Knights of Labor, the American Railway Union, and Industrial Workers of the World. The Secret Society of the Knights of Labor was formed in 1869. This was the first successful labor union in the America and helped influence change. This union united both skilled and unskilled workers in the countryside and cities into one group. The Knights also allowed blacks and women among its ranks. Although they were successful in winning a series of strikes in their fight against long hours and low wages, they most often had difficulty collective bargaining because they represented such a diverse group of workers. The Knights' fall happened after being falsely associated with the anarchists who were responsible for the Haymarket Square bombing in Chicago on May 4, 1886. A demonstration in Chicago's Haymarket Square to protest the killing of 2 workers during a strike turned into a violent riot after a bomb explosion that killed 7 policemen. Although the bomb thrower was never found, the incident was blamed on labor radicalism of the Knights and resulted in the public condemnation and demise of the Knights' labor. The American Railway Union was founded by Eugene Debs. It was an organization for unskilled railroad workers, many of which worked for the Pullman Railroad Company. However, the Pullman Company refused to recognize the ARU for negotiations. The union called for a boycott of all Pullman cars affecting rail lines west of Detroit, eventually leading to the federal government's involvement to stop the strike. The Industrial Workers of the World, whose members were commonly termed Wobblies, is an international labor union that was founded in 1905 in Chicago, Illinois. The union combines general unionism with industrial unionism, as it is a general union whose members are further organized within the industry of their employment. The philosophy and tactics of IWW are described as revolutionary industrial unionism, with ties to both socialist and anarchist labor movements. Big businesses did not like unions forming because their common demands of higher wages, reduced hours, and more safety requirements made it harder for the company to make a larger profit. In order to stop unions, businesses used many tactics against them. Yellow dog contracts were contracts between an employer and worker in which the worker agrees not to join a union throughout the course of his employment. These generally allowed employers to take legal action against those that organize unions that try to encourage the worker to join. The Norris LaGuardia Act made these contracts no longer enforceable in federal courts. Scabs or strikebreakers were individuals who were hired to work during strikes, typically in place of those who were on strike for lower wages. They were hired in hopes of ending a strike, as they were taking the striker's job or slowing it down to where an employer does not have to worry about the strike. Blacklisting was another way businesses were able to control unions a bit. Blacklists were publicized lists of people who were in unions for employers to see, so they knew not to hire them. Typically, those in unions were undesired because they could gain more from being employed than those who were not part of a union. The unions also used many tactics to use against big businesses when they would not comply to the demands of the union. The union workers most commonly would go on strike and would not show up to the factories or railroads to work. This sometimes would make the businesses have to temporarily shut down until the union workers would come back to work. The unions would also use boycotts and picketing to gain support against the big businesses they worked for. The most important tactic unions used against big businesses was solidarity. If one worker was wrongfully treated by the business, then all of the workers of that business that were part of the union would go on strike or boycott against the business. With practically no workers, the businesses, a lot of the time, would have no choice but to comply with the union in order to stay open. In 1877, a strike broke out between Boston and Ohio Railroad Company and the union workers, which eventually spread throughout the country into many different industries, known as the Great Strike of 1877. As a result of the second wage cut in 8 months to try to break up the union by B&O, a series of violent railroad strikes began starting in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Militia was dispatched but were mostly unsuccessful because many of them were workers and supported the strike. Federal troops were then called, and in 4 days the trains were running again. The strikes then broke out at different B&O stations across the country. Workers in Pittsburgh refused to work on a double-header train because it required less workers. They locked the trains up in buildings and burned them to the ground. The National Guard came to stop the strike and ended with violence and 20 workers and guards dead. This set off a general strike throughout Pittsburgh, including miners, steel, and iron workers, and the National Guard was called throughout the state to stop the riots. Another strike broke out in Cumberland, Maryland, that federal troops were also called to because the strikers would not let U.S. mail cars pass through. The strikes later spread all the way up to New York and Ohio, which were quickly ended by the National Guard. By the end of strike, more than half of the country's railroads were shut down and 100 people were killed, but little labor reforms were made. Another strike by unions caused by big businesses' control was the Homestead Strike in 1892. The Homestead Strike was a violent strike of workers for the Carnegie Steel Company in Homestead, Pennsylvania. While Carnegie was away, his partner Henry Clay Frick took over while he was gone. With Frick in charge, he broke off the contract with the union so he could hire non-union workers as well as cut the workers' wages and locked all of the union workers out of the factory by building a barbed wire fence later called Fort Frick. Then Frick called the Pinkerton private security guards to occupy the plant. The steel workers stormed the plant and the piers where the guards were docking their barges and burned them down, killing 3 Pinkertons and 7 strikers. After this, the National Guard was sent in to occupy the plant, and it was reopened 3 days later with replacement workers. There were many charges against the union after the strike, but most were eventually acquitted by the courts. The strike also turned into a racial matter when African Americans wanted to work for the plant but were not allowed by the union, so they became the replacement workers after the strike. This resulted in more violence coming from the ex-workers of the plant, but eventually they gave up the fight and some reapplied for jobs at the mill after agreeing to a 12-hour workday and reduced wages. By the end of the strike, however, no rights of the workers were gained and many workers did not get their jobs back. One of the most notable strikes at this time was the Pullman Strike, the National Railroad strike against the Pullman Palace Car Company in the summer of 1894. The strike started when Pullman cut the workers' wages by 25%, simultaneously raising the prices of food, rent, and other essentials in the Pullman Company town where most of the workers and their families lived. Supported by the American Railway Union, the workers decided to boycott the Pullman Company, and when they were fired to hire non-union workers, the rest of the union quit out of solidarity, hurting the Pullman Company more by halting many railroads. Debs and the ARU helped the workers with their boycott, but warned against taking actions that would allow for the federal government to get involved, which the boycotters ignored. The strike quickly became violent when strikers overturned a U.S. Mail Service train car, which was a federal offense allowing federal government involvement. Troops were sent to Illinois to end the Reign of Terror. The Supreme Court ordered an injunction enacting the Sherman Antitrust Act and stopped the ARU from communicating with the strikers. By early August, the strike was settled and Pullman railroads reopened. Between 4 and 30 people were killed by the end of it. The government in the Gilded Age was very pro-laissez-faire. They allowed big businesses to grow with very little to no federal involvement or regulations. This allowed many businesses to expand, some more than others. As big businesses grew, they were able to knock out a lot of their competition in that industry. A lot of times, this resulted in a monopoly. When one company had the majority control of one industry with little to no competition, they were able to practically do whatever they wanted and overcharge for their product, hurting the middle and lower working classes and small businesses. In order to prevent this from happening, the government repealed the laissez-faire policies to enact Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. This act was the first act of its kind to limit the power of one business to increase competition by restricting trade, making monopolies illegal. The federal court can fine, imprison, or dissolve firms in violation, as well as private companies affected can sue up to 3 times the amount of damages done to them. The act was mostly unsuccessful because of the wide range of interpretations it allowed in the Supreme Court. In the Supreme Court case United States v. E.C. Knight Company in 1895, the Supreme Court ruled that Knight did not have a monopoly in sugar refinery, even though it controlled about 98% of the industry, basically proving the Antitrust Act had little to no power. In 1914, the Roosevelt administration created the Clayton Antitrust Act and the Federal Trade Commission. In 1920, the Rule of Reason was created, which gave more specifics to the Sherman Antitrust Act, making it much more effective. The Rule of Reason that not all combinations were violations of the Act, only those involving acquisitions, mergers, exclusionary tactics, and predatory pricing that caused an unreasonable restraint on trade along with Roosevelt's trust-busting campaigns. Enforcing the Act. 1904, in the court case Minnesota v. Northern Securities Company, the federal government dissolved the company when it was founded in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. The 1911 Standard Oil Company and the American Tobacco Company were dissolved under the Antitrust Act as well.